I was having a routine checkup at my doctor's office when they said, have you had an EKG in the last couple of years? I said, no, I don't remember when the last time was I had one. And so they hooked me up to those, things they put around your heart. And afterwards, the doctor came in and said, that came back very unusual. And so we need to do additional testing. So they set me up to get a stress test where you run on the treadmill and you're all hooked up. And then also to do a sonogram where they actually look at your heart. So I couldn't get in for almost 2 weeks to get these procedures done. So after hearing from a doctor that there's something unusual with your heart and that you need these tests, what do you naturally have the next 2 weeks? But I'd be feeling like it's a little tight there, I can't tell you how many times, if I was your hypochondriac type, I would have been in the emergency room about a dozen times. I'd be like, does that feel sore? I know you get, no, I think I'm okay. And even I was trying to decide, I play tennis every Thursday, and so I'm weighing, do I play tennis? Don't I play tennis? I love play tennis. So I went ahead and played tennis, but I will say I did not run as much as I would normally run. And even between sets, I'd be kind of checking like, yeah, I think I'm okay. I'm not feeling lightheaded. I'd be going through all the things that would be telling me I'm having a heart attack. So the good news was I got the test results back. Everything's fine. Matter of fact, during the stress test, the lady said, wow, you're in really good shape, which obviously I'm not. But the fact is, when it came to running, she had to keep ramping up the speed and ramping it up to get my heart up to the rate because my heart just doesn't have to work very hard. So anyway, that was good news. But I have to admit, it got me thinking. You get that kind of news, mid-40s, what? Maybe there's a problem with my heart. And as I was thinking about it this week, the fact is, the average American man lives to the age of 76. That's average. So if I'm average, I am now 60% done with my life. Only 40% is left. I was kind of like, wow. Now, obviously, maybe I'll live to be 90. That an average is, maybe longer or shorter. But the fact is, probably more than half my life at this point is gone. And so I remember thinking about the boys. That was my first thoughts. Honestly, when they told me maybe there's a problem with my heart, the first thing I thought is, Lord, if I have to die, a heart attack is really the way I want to go. That's just the truth. I've watched people die of, cancer and so many Alzheimer's, awful diseases. I don't want to have a heart attack and then linger for months, but a quick boom and I'm gone. That sounds pretty good to me, to be perfectly honest. But then I got to thinking about the boys, and I thought about, if I were to go now, they're young, David's 12, what would that do to them? And I was thinking, I want to see them graduate someday. I want to see them maybe get married, possibly have children. So it made me, again, just kind of look at my life and where am I at and what am I doing? So what about you? If you were to find out that you had a heart problem, which ends up I don't, but for 2 weeks I didn't know that, what would you think? If you knew that today was your last day on earth, what would you do differently? If you knew you had 24 hours, how would you spend those 24 hours? My guess is you would not do what you normally do. If normally you go home and watch sports Sunday afternoon, my guess is that probably would no longer seem all that important to you. If chores are what you typically do, maybe that wouldn't seem like a big deal either. So what would you do if you knew your time was limited? Well, it's good to think about these questions from time to time. Martin Luther said that we should every day realize that this could be the day of our death. In his books, The 7 Secrets of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey talks about keeping the end in sight. In other words, living every day for what is really important. It's a great biblical principle. Martyred missionary Jim Elliot said he wanted to live so that when it came time for him to die, there would be nothing else he needed to do but die. In earlier generations, Christians talked a lot about death. Puritans actually wrote books about how to die well. Ray Pritchard writes this. He said, I have a friend who served in combat in Vietnam. He was captured by the North Vietnamese, shot in both feet, but later he escaped by crawling out of the prison camp on his hands and knees. He knows all about war because he's seen men die in battle. Pritchard says, not long ago he told me that Americans are afraid to die. He wasn't talking about the brave men and women of our armed forces. He meant ordinary Americans are afraid to die. The man told Ray, the difference between terrorists and us is that we are afraid to die, and they're not. He says, we were sitting in a park bench in the center of a beautiful city on a lovely summer day. There were couples strolling around holding hands, others lying out on the grass. And the man said to him, we think we're already living in heaven. We think we've already got the best of all possible worlds. Why would anyone want to leave this? And so we try to ignore death. Even inside the church, we're a little squeamish about talking about death. If you're trying to get a new small group going, What you don't say to people is, hey, I got this new group. We're going to meet Friday nights at our house. We're going to talk about death. We're just going to talk about, dying every week. You know what? Nobody is going to come to that group. I feel sorry for some of the pastors that I know who are in churches that are set in the graveyards are around them. Stelton Baptist is that way. There's an Episcopal church over in Edison, completely surrounded by old tombstones. You know what? People don't want to be reminded of their death. That is not a happy thought. Well, the fact is, though, that all of us will die. And so, again, if this was our last day on earth, what would we do differently? And that brings us to the last chapter in Elijah's story, 2 Kings chapter 2. We learn about how a person of God leaves this earth well. We started out on our journey with Elijah. If you remember, he went to the widow of Zarephath. There was a time of famine. God said he would provide for them. He did. Then he went back to King Ahab, let him know, hey, it's time. There's going to be a showdown. There was a showdown at Mount Carmel. God responded with fire from heaven. And then his life is threatened by the queen, and he goes off running, depressed and discouraged, and hides in the desert. And God refreshes him and renews him. And he even gave him at the end some work to do. He said, hey, you're not done with you yet. And the Lord told him to go and anoint a guy named Elisha, who basically would be kind of the man who followed in Elijah's place. So Elijah, the older one, has the J. Elisha, the S, is the younger one. And so this younger protege has now been learning under Elijah and has been with him. And we come to 2 Kings chapter 2, beginning of verse 1. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, stay here, the Lord has sent me to Bethel. But Elisha said, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel. The company of the prophets of Bethel came to Elisha, again the younger one, and asked, do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today? Yes, I know, Elisha replied, please be quiet. Then Elijah said to him, stay here, Elisha, the Lord has sent me to Jericho. And he replied, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. So they went to Jericho. The company of the prophets at Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, do you know the Lord is going to take your master from you today? Yes, I know, he replied, so be quiet. And then Elijah said to him, stay here, the Lord has sent me to Jordan. And he replied, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. So the two of them walked on. It's the last day of Elijah's life, and he's got a lot of walking to do. He starts in Samaria, goes to Gilgal, from Gilgal to Bethel, from Bethel down to Jericho, and then from Jericho he has to go and cross the Jordan River. He's going through the hills and ravines of his childhood. And amid these lonely rocks and gullies, God prepares the prophet to meet his Lord. That's quite a bit of walking in that day. Some people argue maybe he was just old, it was his time. The fact is, friends, this is miles and miles across rugged terrain. Clearly he was in good shape. It wasn't that he was too old to continue on. But God had another plan for him. Well, it's clear that Elisha, his young protege, knew that this was Elijah's last day. God had made it clear to him and also to the prophets in these various cities. And so this explains why Elijah did all the walking that last day. He wanted to go and share his final words of wisdom and comfort, encouragement, to go and to minister to these prophets that he had been with over the years. In each of his towns, there was kind of a hometown seminary where they were being trained, and he wanted to go and talk to them. In Gilgal, Bethel, Jericho, everywhere he went, the school of prophets was dismissed so they could go and spend time with the prophet Elijah. God had not only told Elijah and Elisha, he'd also told all of these prophets. Now, I think Elijah knew this was the day, but I don't think he knew exactly the time. And I don't think he knew exactly how he was going to go. All he knew is that it was time. Now, he keeps saying to Elisha, hey, listen, God's sending me to this place. You can stay here. And Elisha goes, no way. Surely as God lives, surely as you live, I'm going with you. I think in some ways it was a test of his tenacity and his loyalty. He was saying, wherever you go, I'll go. I'll be there with you to the end. It's a touching picture of the loyalty of this younger man who had learned from his older mentor. So Elijah spends his final day with Elisha and spends time greeting and saying words of wisdom and farewell to the other prophets who would look up to him as a mentor, a hero. Well, there's no sense of panic as we read this. Elijah does not seem to be afraid at all. Neither of them, Elijah, Elisha, neither of them is upset. There's no fear. There's no dread. Just a sense of being completely in God's hands. And then we come to verse 7. 50 men from the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. And when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," Elisha replied. "You've asked a difficult thing," Elijah said. "Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." So they get to the Jordan River. Elijah takes off his cloak, which is kind of the symbol of the prophet's authority. He rolls it up and he slaps the river with it. And just like the sea, it parted and they walk across on dry land. The reminder that Elijah had the power of God in him the same way that Moses had experienced God's power. So then Elijah says to him, "What can I do for you? You know, this is it. What thing can I give you?" He says, "What I'd like is I'd like a double portion of your spirit." Now, in those times, it was very common for the eldest son to receive a double portion of the inheritance. And what he doesn't ask for money or fame. He doesn't ask for worldly power. What he wants is the Spirit of God that is so powerfully lived in Elijah. He wants twice as much of that power of God in him, the strength of God. It's like he's saying to his spiritual father, "My father, give me what you have spiritually. I want what you have." Why did he ask this? Because the days were just going to get harder. Elijah's time was difficult. The people turned away from God. But Elisha would see even more so. And so he needed the power of God in his life. He needed the courage of Elijah, the boldness of Elijah. He wanted the same Spirit of God that on Mount Carmel had shown clearly that the Lord was God. He wanted it, and more than that, he knew he needed it. Well, in verse 10, Elijah says to him, "You've asked a difficult thing." Really, it's a gift only God can give. He says, "Listen, if you see me, when God comes to take me, then you'll know that the Lord has answered your prayer. And if you don't see me go, then you'll know he is not." So verse 11. As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them. And Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this, and he cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." And Elisha saw him no more. And then he took hold of his garment and he tore it in two. And Elisha then picked up Elijah's cloak that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. He took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and he struck the water with it. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he asked. And when he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. So now we get to the end of Elijah's life. Verse 11 tells us they're walking along. Suddenly this chariot of fire, led by horses of fire, come. You know, it's a military image. It's a reminder that he really was a warrior for God. And God came in power, revealed himself. It was a sign and a symbol of really the battle that was raging in the hearts of the people of Israel. As they kept wanting to turn away from God, Elijah kept pointing them back to him. It was a symbol of the life Elijah had led. Verse 11 tells us that he then went up to heaven in a whirlwind. You know, his life had been a whirlwind of activity. God sent him there. God sent him here. He sent him all over the place. Gave him difficult messages. And God did amazing things through him. And so now this whirlwind comes and it takes him up into heaven. Now we tend to focus on how spectacular this is. Like, wow, chariots of fire, the horses on fire going up to heaven, a whirlwind. But I think what's more important is the fact that it says this, Elisha saw this, and he cried out. God revealed to him what was happening. The fact is, the other prophets don't seem to see exactly what happens with Elijah. Matter of fact, later in this passage, we're not going to read it today, they go to Elisha and they say, hey, let's send out people, we'll go look for him. Elisha's telling him, no, there's no need to. No, we'll go look. He's going, no, there's no need to. And they kept pressing him. Finally, he's so embarrassed, he's like, okay, go look. And they go and look, and he's nowhere to be found. Only Elisha saw exactly what God had done. And it was God's way of showing him that, yes, I've heard your request. So what does he do? He takes the robe of Elijah, again, the symbol of the prophet's authority that had fallen off of him. I don't think that's by mistake. The rest of his clothes don't appear to have fallen, just this cloak. And so Elijah goes and Elisha takes it and he goes to the water. And he asks, where is the God of Elijah, and he slaps the water with it. Now, this took some real faith on Elisha's part. Elisha doesn't know what's going to happen. He doesn't really know for sure that God has heard his prayer. And so when he's doing this, the 50 prophets can see, they're over on the other side of the river, and they're watching, and imagine what would happen if he takes it and slaps the water like Elijah did, and nothing happened. Yeah, there's Elisha. Mr. Oh, I'm loved the most by Elijah. Oh yeah, Mr. I'm going to take his cloak and do what he did. Look at him. So he's taking a real faithful risk. But he trusts God, he slaps the water, and the Lord reveals himself. Where's the God of Elijah? He is still exactly where he had been before, with him, and ready to work in him and through him. If you see me, Elijah had said, then you'll know. Elisha's eyes had been opened by God to see the flaming horses, the chariot. He was the only one who saw him taken away in the whirlwind. There's a kind of seeing with the eyes, and there's a seeing with the eyes of the heart. You know, it's possible to have 20/20 vision and miss what's right in front of you. It's possible to live 80 years with perfect vision and yet be totally blind spiritually. That's why Paul says in Ephesians 1:17 that the eyes of your heart might be opened. That was his prayer, that the eyes of our heart would be open. You can go to Sunday school all your life, be involved in a care group. You can go to seminary and yet never have your heart truly opened. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24, we read this. By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. He saw him who is invisible. Well, how do you see someone who's invisible? I mean, if God cannot be seen, how do you see him? Well, it's two words. By faith. Moses had faith, and his faith gave him sight. He saw the God who is invisible. Faith is what really gives us the ability to see what others cannot see. Faith believes what is true even when others don't believe it at all. By faith we see the reality, which means that we see beyond this world that's around us. By faith we take the words of Scripture to be true, that God has heaven waiting for us, that there is more than this life. The famous hymn, Amazing Grace, said, I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Because God opens the eyes of our heart. Maybe we don't actually see it with our eyes, our heart understands it. By faith we see what others do not see. You ever looked at one of those 3D picture books? Remember when the boys were young, someone gave us one, they said, really cool. Every page was a different picture, and the pictures would normally be like a lot of dots with like some designs in them. There's like these squiggly, kind of weird looking things. But if you put them up to your face, and you kind of, what you do is you stare at it, but you kind of let your eyes go out of focus. And then as you move it away, suddenly you see there's 3D images in there that you had no idea were there. So this week, as I was planning to talk about this, I pulled out Google. We only have the book. I love Google, and so I typed in 3D images, and I found some of them on there. And I remember looking at one. It was blue, just again a bunch of dots with a couple designs in the middle of it. And you look up close, and it takes a while. And I wanted to actually show it to you. I was going to show you guys so you can do it, but the reality is I couldn't remember how it works. You've got to be like that far away. So you just stare at it, and I started to pull my face away from the monitor, and all of a sudden there's a penguin. Same color as everything else, but there's the shape of a 3D penguin, and then behind it, there's some other smaller penguins and like a snowbank. And all of this, and now about that far away, and it's clear as day, how could I have missed that? It's all right there to see, but what I found is if I just pulled a little too far away, it was gone. Or even if I blinked for more than just a quick blink, it was gone. And I could now stare at it from there, and there was no way of finding it. Matter of fact, I had Chris, our administrative assistant, I said, Chris, you got to come see this. This is so cool. And so she comes in, and she said, I have glasses. Sometimes I can't, at least I'm not able to see these things. And so she tried it. Sure enough, she's like, no, I don't see it. And I tried 2 or 3 of them. And one of them I looked at, and I tried back, forward. I could never see it. Does that mean the 3D image wasn't there? No, it just meant Adam shaking, an engineer shaking his head, yes. Engineers are a little too literal. No, the image was there. I couldn't see it. When Chris didn't see the penguin, is it because Mark is crazy? Well, I'm not going to ask that. I don't trust you guys enough to ask you that question. Mark is not crazy. It's that it was there, but Chris simply could not see it. Her eyes couldn't register it. And friends, that's true spiritually also. Just because it can't be seen doesn't mean it's not there. It's not as if the penguin body suddenly materialized out of nothing. It had been there. I just had never been able to see it. It's the same way with the life of faith. The hidden world of eternal reality is there, whether we choose to see it or not, whether we can see it or not. And by faith we see it, though the people around us might not see it. You know, it's so easy to get frustrated with people in our lives that we love and just don't get our faith. We just don't understand. They don't seem to want to listen to the truth. How can they not see, we wonder? Because their eyes are still closed. Their eyes of their heart are not open. You know, you don't get mad at someone who's blind. Why can't you see the color green? No, they're blind. We understand that. In the same way, those who don't know Christ, their hearts are blind. And so what can we do? We can pray for them. Ask God to reveal to them what's already there. We can share with them, and that's certainly very important to do, but also we have to ask God to reveal what only He can reveal, that He will open them up to see the truth. They will never believe what they do not see, and so God alone has to open their eyes to understand. Elijah says, you can have the power if you see me depart. He didn't mean just if you see me visually departing. It's if God would open up the eyes spiritually of Elisha's heart. How do I know God answered this prayer? Not just because he hit the water and it separated. We know that God answered this prayer because later on, chapter 6 of this same 2 Kings, Elisha is with his servant, and they are surrounded by the enemy, the country of Aram. His king's got all of his men there, and the servant's despairing because they're going to die. And Elijah said this. He says, those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Later on he prays, O Lord, open his eyes that he may see. And then God opens his eyes and reveals that around them there is arrayed an army of God's doing. His angels, his angelic host. Elijah has seen all along what his servant could not see, that God was there and they had nothing to fear. Elisha saw spiritual reality. He saw what was behind the scene. So again, he takes the cloak and he goes and he parts the river. And the Lord shows again his power and that he is with him. The fact is, this wouldn't have happened, though, if Elijah hadn't gone. His cloak is left behind. God has now passed the torch on to the next generation. And with every generation, God has to raise up the next generation. Those of us who are here now, if the Lord chooses not to come back, we need to be raising up the next generation. That's why I love on the worship team. We've got 2 drummers who are both like in middle school who are amazing. We've got a couple of flute player, singer, high schoolers. Like those of us in our mid-40s, I'm like the old guy, you know. I love seeing the younger generation stepping in and being used by God because God has great things planned for each generation. We have to do our part. Leaders rise, they lead, they fight God's fight, and then at the appointed hour, they move on to be replaced by others that God has raised up. So let me ask you, if this were your last day, how would you spend it? How would you receive that news? If someone told you you have 24 hours to live, how would you respond to that? I'll never forget, many of you knew Kevin Campbell, a member of our church, and it was a Thursday. I was playing tennis, and Thursday was my day off, by the way. I wasn't just playing tennis. So it's my day off, I'm playing tennis, and afterwards I checked my voicemail, and there's a message saying Kevin's in the hospital. Ends up he had gone to see the doctor, a routine test, and they had discovered there was something funny in his blood work. The doctor says you got to go to an oncologist immediately. The oncologist says you've got to go to the hospital right now. And so I get to the hospital, and he's just gotten the news that he has a kind of cancer that there's really not a very high percentage of people who survive it. And Kevin was completely calm. And he said to me the words of Job. He said, yet though he slay me, still will I praise him. His response was, God is God. And my life is his. And whatever he chooses. And friends, that needs to be our response. We don't know how long we have. Our time here on earth zips by, it flies away, and then it's gone. We're here today, we're gone tomorrow. Elijah went to heaven. Elisha carried on his work. The good news is this: God's work goes on. When the Lord took Pastor Bob Basham away from us, Bob was as godly as a man as I've ever met, humble, gracious. He was the perfect right hand to me. Wherever I'm weak, he was strong. And yet the Lord chose to take him because God had other things to do. We don't always understand, but God raises up those that we need. So what are we doing with our time? Elijah's got a day left. What he does not do is say, you know what, there's a couple things on my bucket list that I have never done, and I got to go do those. There's this really cool thing over in that city. I got to go check that out. No. He goes and he invests the last hours he has in those whose lives he's been changing, the one he's been ministering to. Elijah spent his last day on earth serving God and ministering to others. So as you look at your life, what images come to mind? How will you be remembered on your last day? What will your kids say about you, your spouse, your friends, your co-workers? What regrets will you have? Baseball player Tug McGraw won 2 World Series with the New York Mets and also was one of the best closing pitchers in the Philadelphia Phillies history. And I'm so thankful Pastor Mike isn't here, because if I said Philadelphia Phillies, he would have comments to make. So he's not here. We get to keep going. 2003, doctors discovered a brain tumor. And they told Tug, who was 59 years old, that he had 3 weeks to live. He actually ended up living 9 months. He poured his time into his family, into a charity he dedicated to fighting brain cancer, and even to reconciling with a part of his past he ignored. You see, he had a wife, he had children, but he also had a son from another woman that he had just really spent very little time with. Matter of fact, this boy had grown up in poverty, whereas his dad was a famous baseball player. The boy's mother did not tell her son about his famous dad, in part because she wanted to move on from that time in her life. And so she told him the man she was with was his dad. But later on, when he was 11 years old, Tim found his birth certificate and learned that his father was the famous baseball player that he loved, Tug McGraw. Tim changed his name from Tim Trimble to Tim McGraw so he'd be more like his dad. Well, Tim found Tug when he was an older teenager, but Tug really didn't want anything to do with him. When it was time for college, he contacted his father and asked his father if he would help him pay for school. Tug said, "I will help, but on the promise that you will never again bother me." Well, Tim said, "Okay, but if we can just meet." And they met, and then Tug changed his mind, and they started a relationship. And this second time the attraction took. And so when the news came that Tug's life was running out, they became closer still. And in the end, Tug McGraw died at Tim McGraw's home in Nashville, Tennessee. In 2004, country singer Tim McGraw's song, "Live Like You Were Dying," the very song that we use, if you remember our Live Like We Were Dying sermon series, that song stayed on the charts for 10 weeks at #1, the longest in a 30-year stretch in country music. The song was also named the top country song of the year by Billboard magazine. It was a story of a man who found out he was dying and decided how he was going to spend his last days. And Tim dedicated it to his father, Tug. So let me ask you this. Would it make a difference if you learned how little time you had left? I mean, thankfully, Tug had 9 months to try to fix some things that were broken and change some things that shouldn't have been as they were. Would it change your priorities if you knew that your time was limited? Because let me tell you, it is. Your time is limited. I don't feel like I'm very old. 60% of the way done. Wow. Friends, what are we doing with what God has given us? We're all running out of time. The opportunity to leave our legacy is one day shorter today than it was yesterday. I want to close with a video clip. In this scene, Maximus, who's a Roman general, wants nothing more than to go back to his wife and to his young son and to his farm. But he has to say some encouraging words to his men before one last battle. Now, just to help you understand what he's saying, the word Elysium was the word they used back then for the afterlife. Let's watch.
will be so. Hold the line. Stay with me. You find yourself alone, riding in green fields with the sun on your face. Do not be troubled, for you are in Elysium, and you're already dead. Brothers, what we do in life echoes in eternity.
What we do in life echoes in eternity. And friends, that's so true. So let me ask you, are you living for that eternity? Or are you making God's priorities your priorities? Whose lives are you touching? What differences are you making? It's not too late. You know, Tug McGraw had really left a broken relationship, and a kid who was hurt. I heard an interview by Tim McGraw where he said, yeah, it was tough growing up in poverty and seeing this guy and knowing this was his father. And yet at the end, the relationship was repaired. None of us knows how long we have to live. If I'm average, I'm more than 3/5 of the way done. But the fact is, none of us are average. Odds are I'm not going to die on my 76th birthday. I could die tomorrow, or I could die 50 years from now. But the fact is, we don't know. So if you knew you had 24 hours to live like Elijah knew, what would you do with that time? What things would matter the most to you? Because those things should be the things that matter the most to you right now and every day. What we do in life echoes in eternity. Let's pray.